Hi everyone, my name is Marina. Today we're going to start reading a new book. It is called Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. So I read this book in a high school English class. I really enjoyed it and I decided to read this again and share it with you. It is a book about a doctor called Paul Farmer who works with Harvard and also a clinic in Haiti, and he is an expert in global health, and the book is like a very good example of how doctors are helping like patients around the world. So, Chapter 1. 6 years after the fact, Dr. Paul Edward Farmer reminded me. We met because of beheading, of all things. It was 2 weeks before Christmas 1994. In a market town in the central plateau of Haiti, a patch of paved road called Mirabales. Near the center of town there was a Haitian army outpost, a concrete wall enclosing a weedy parade field, a jail, and a mustard-colored barracks. I was sitting with an American Special Forces captain named John Carroll on the building's second-story balcony. Evening was coming on, the town's best hour. When the air changed from hot to balmy and the music from the radios in the rum shops and the horns of the tap-taps passing through town grew loud and bright, and the general filth and poverty began to be obscured, the open sewers and the ragged clothing and the looks on the face of malnourished children and the extended hands of elderly beggars, plaintively saying garango, which means hungry in Creole. I was in Haiti to report on American soldiers. 20,000 of them have been sent to reinstate the country's democratically elected government and to strip away power from the military junta that had deposited it and ruled with great cruelty for 3 years. Captain Carroll had only 8 men, and they were temporarily in charge of keeping the peace among 150,000 Haitians, spread across about 1,000 square miles of rural Haiti. A seemingly impossible job. And yet, out here in the Central Plateau, political violence had all but ended. In the past month, there had been only one murder. Then again, it had been spectacularly grisly. A few weeks back, Captain Carroll's men had finished the headless corps of the assistant mayor of Mirabales out of the Artibonite River. He was one of the elected officials being restored to power. Suspicion for his murder had fallen on one of the junta's local functionaries, a rural sheriff named Nerva Just, a frightening figure to most people in the region. Captain Carroll and his men had brought Just in for questioning, but they hadn't found any physical evidence or witness, so they had to release him. The captain was 29 years old, a devout Baptist from Alabama. I liked him. From what I'd seen, he and his men had been trying earnestly to make improvements in this piece of Haiti, but Washington, which had decreed that this mission would not include nation building, had given them virtually no tools for that job. On one occasion, the captain had ordered an U.S. Army medevac flight for a pregnant Haitian woman in distress, and his commanders had reprimanded him for his pains. Up on the balcony of the barracks now, Captain Carroll was fuming about his latest frustration when someone said there was an American out at the gate who wanted to see him. There were 5 visitors, actually, 4 of them Haitians. They stood in the gathering shadows in front of the barracks, while their American friend came over. He told Captain Carroll that his name was Paul Farmer, that he was a doctor, and he worked in a hospital here, some miles north of Mirabales. I remember thinking that Captain Carroll and Dr. Farmer made a mismatched pair, and that Farmer suffered in the comparison. The captain stood about 6 foot tall, tanned and muscular. As usual, a wad of snuff enlarged his lower lip. Now and then he turned his head aside and spat. Farmer was about the same age, but much more delicate looking. He had short black hair and a high waist and long thin arms, and his nose came almost to a point. Next to the soldier, he looked skinny and pale, and for all that he struck me as bold, indeed downright cocky. He asked the captain if his team had any medical problems. The captain said they had some sick prisoners whom the local hospital has refused to treat. I ended up buying the medicine myself. Farmer flashed a smile. You'll spend less time in purgatory. Then he asked, who cut off the head of the assistant mayor? I don't know for sure, said the captain. It is very hard to live in Haiti and not know who cut off someone's head, said Farmer. A circuitous argument followed. Farmer made it plain he didn't like the American government's plan for fixing Haiti's economy, a plan that would aid business interests but do nothing. In his view, to relieve the suffering of the average Haitian. He clearly believed that the United States had helped foster the coup, for one thing, by having trained a high official of the junta at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. Two clear sides existed in Haiti, Farmer said. The force of repression and the Haitian poor, the vast majority. Farmers was on the side of the poor. But, he told the captain, it still seems fuzzy which side the American soldiers are on. Locally, part of the fuzziness came from the fact that the captain had released the hated Nerva Just. I sensed that Farmer knew Haiti far better than the captain, and that he was trying to impart some important information. The people in this region were losing confidence in the captain. Farmer seemed to be saying, and this was a serious matter, obviously for a team of 9 soldiers trying to govern 150,000 people. But the warning wasn't entirely plain, and the captain got a little riled up at Farmer's denunciation of the School of the Americas. As for Nerva Just, he said, look, that guy is a bad guy. When I do have him and the evidence, I will slam him. He slapped a fist into his hand. But I'm not gonna stoop to the level of these guys and make summary arrests. Farmer replied, in effect, that it made no sense for the captain to apply principles of constitutional law in a country that at the moment had no functioning legal system. Just was a menace and should be locked up. So they reached a strange impasse. The captain, who described himself as a redneck, arguing for due process, and Farmer, who clearly considered himself a champion of human rights, arguing for preventative detention. Eventually, the captain said, you'd be surprised how many decisions about what I can do here get made in Washington. And Farmer said, I understand you are constrained. Sorry if I've been haranguing. It had grown dark. The 2 men stood in a square of light from the open barracks door. They shook hands. As the young doctor disappeared into the shadow, I heard him speaking Creole to his Haitian friends. I stayed with the soldiers for several weeks. I didn't think much about Farmer. In spite of his closing words, I didn't think he understood or cared to sympathize with the captain's problems. Then by chance I ran into him again, on my way home, on the plane to Miami. He was sitting in first class. He explained that the flight attendants put him here because he often flew this route, and on occasion dealt with medical emergencies on board. The attendants let me sit with him for a while. I had dozens of questions about Haiti, including one about the assistant mayor's murder. The soldiers thought that voodoo beliefs conferred a special, weird terror on decapitation. Does cutting off the victim's head have some basis in the history of voodoo? I asked. It has some basis in the history of brutality, Farmer answered. He frowned, and then he touched my arm, as if to say that we all ask stupid questions sometimes. This is so far pretty interesting, because I still don't quite understand how the decapitation part happened and what's the significance of it. But it seems like Dr. Farmer understands Haiti very well, and he's going to lead us into more of the backgrounds. I found out more about him. For one thing, he didn't dislike soldiers. I grew up in a trailer park, and I know which economic class joins the American military, he told me, speaking of Captain Carroll. You meet these 29-year-old soldiers, and you realize, come on, they're not the ones making the bad policies. He confirmed my impression that he had visited the captain to warn him. Many of Farmer's patients and Haitian friends had complained about the release of Nerva Just, saying it proved the Americans hadn't really come to help them. Farmer told me he was driving through Mirabales and his Haitian friends were teasing him, saying he didn't dare stop and talk to the American soldiers about the murder case. And then the truck got a flat tire right outside the army compound, and he said to his friend, "Aha, you have to listen to messages from angels." I got Farmer to tell me a little bit about his life. He was 35. He had graduated from Harvard Medical School and also had a PhD in anthropology from Harvard. He worked in Boston 4 months of the year, living in a church rectory in a poor neighborhood. The rest of the year he worked without pay in Haiti, mainly doctoring peasants who had lost their land to a hydroelectric dam. He had been expelled from Haiti during the time of the junta, but had sneaked back to his hospital. After the payment, he said, of an insultingly small bribe. I looked for him after the plane landed. We talked some more in a coffee shop, and I nearly missed my connecting flight. A few weeks later, I took him to dinner in Boston, hoping he could help make sense of what I was trying to write about Haiti, which he seemed glad to do. He clarified some of the history for me, but left me wondering about him. He described himself as a poor people's doctor, but he didn't quite fit my preconception of such a person. He clearly liked the fancy restaurant, the heavy cloth napkins, the good bottle of wine. What struck me that evening was how happy he seemed with his life. Obviously, a man with his advantages would have been doing good works as a doctor while commuting between Boston and a pleasant suburb, not between a room in what I imagined must be a grubby church rectory and the wasteland of central Haiti. The way he talked, it seemed like he actually enjoyed living among Haitian peasant farmers. At one point, speaking of medicine, he said, "I don't know why everybody isn't excited by it." He smiled at me, and his face turned bright, not red so much as glowing, a luminescent smile. It affected me quite strongly, like a welcome gladly given, one you didn't have to earn. I feel I have so much respect for Dr. Farmer because with his doctorate degree, he could be living a very decent life in a suburb like what the author is saying, but he actually enjoys helping poor people without getting any money for his service. So I think he's definitely a very noble man. After our dinner, I drifted out of touch with him. Mainly, I now think, because he also disturbed me. Writing my article about Haiti, I came to share the pessimism of the doctors I had stayed with. I think we should have left Haiti to itself, one of Captain Carroll's men had said to me. Does it really matter who's in power? They're still gonna have the rich and the poor, and no one in between. I don't know what we hope to accomplish. We're still going to have a shitload of Haitians in boats wanting to go to America. But I guess it's best not to even try and figure it out. The soldiers had come to Haiti and lifted a terror and restored a government. And they had left, and the country was just about as poor and broken down as when they had arrived. They had done their best, I thought. They were worldly and tough. They wouldn't cry about things beyond their control. I felt as though, in Farmer, I'd been offered another way of thinking about a place like Haiti, but his way would be hard to share because it implied such an extreme definition of a term like doing one's best. The world is full of miserable places. One way of living comfortably is not to think about them, or when you do, to send money. Over the next 5 years, I mailed some small sums to the charity that supported Farmers Hospital in Haiti. He sent back handwritten thank you notes on each occasion. Once from a friend of a friend, I heard he was doing something notable in international health, something to do with tuberculosis. I didn't look into the details, though, and I didn't see him until near the end of 1999. I was the one who made the appointment. He named the place. Chapter 2. Outside the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, you're aware of a relative urban quiet. A Wall Street of medicine surrounds you. The campus of Harvard Medical School and the Countway Medical Library, Children's Hospital, Beth Israel Deaconess, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, the Brigham. The buildings look imposing, packed together, and even awesome when you let yourself imagine what's going inside. Chest cracking, organ transplants, molecular imaging, genetic probes, gloved hands and machines routinely reaching into bodies and making diagnoses and corrections. So much of human frailty on the one hand and boldness on the other. One feels stilled in the presence of this enterprise. Even the Boston drivers, famously deranged, don't honk much when passing through this neighborhood. The Brigham occupies one side of Francis Street and envelopes, like a city around a Roman ruin, the renovated Victorian lobby of the old Peter Bent Brigham, a relic of the history of Boston medicine. The modern entrance, a towering atrium with marble floors, lies a quarter of a mile away, at the end of a shiny corridor called the Pike, short for turnpike, flanked by banks of elevators. Clinical departments to the right and left, inpatient wards on the floors above, operating rooms below, 40 not counting the one in obstetrics, dozens of laboratories in all directions, and mortal dramas everywhere. It is a medical mall, a teaching hospital and a full-service hospital, and a tertiary care facility, a hospital to which other hospitals forward their most difficult cases. Crowds move up and down the pike in white uniforms and street clothes, carrying bouquets of flowers, trailing the sound of many mingled conversations. Wow, this part makes me want to go to that place and see it for myself, how all the marvels look like. Right now, during COVID, we are not allowed to go to hospitals and look at what things are being done, but I hope in the future I get to visit Harvard and all those very cool places. 4 floors down in radiology, Dr. Farmer and his team had staked out a quiet spot, an empty windowless room, where they are discussing the last of their cases for the day. Farmer had recently turned 40. Perhaps his hair had receded slightly since I've seen him. 5 years ago. He looked a little thinner, too, and was much more formally attired. He wore wire-framed glasses with little round lenses and a black suit, and a necktie clinched up tight. He was still spending most of his time in Haiti. But he was also a big-shot Boston doctor now, a professor both of medicine and medical anthropology at Harvard Medical School, and an attending specialist on the Brigham's senior staff. Looking at him, sitting with 2 of his students, young doctors in white coats, I imagined a 19th century daguerreotype, the austere, august doctor of medicine in a stiff high collar and a waistcoat. That impression didn't last. He and the young doctors discussed a patient who had recently been treated for a parasite in the brain. The man had become hydrocephalic, and the neurosurgeons had implanted a shunt to drain off the fluid. There was no evidence of further infection, but should the patient be treated for one, just to be safe? What do you think? Farmer asked his team, and they batted the question around, and Farmer mostly just listened, though it was clear that he was in charge. After a few minutes, the team agreed they should treat the patient. Then the phone rang. Farmer picked it up and said, "HIV Central, how can we help?" The caller was a female parasitologist, an old close colleague of Farmer's, offering her view on the hydrocephalic patient. "Warm lady," Farmer exclaimed. "How are you, Pumpkin?" "Oh, I'm fine. Listen, it's scandalous to say, but we don't agree. We want to treat his ass. ID says treat. Love ID." These last 2 lines were a saying of his. I'd heard him use it earlier that day, and I'd worked it out myself. ID stood for infectious disease, his specialty, and the command was uttered as if in a letter, and generally meant that he wanted to treat a patient at once, rather than wait for further tests. Clearly, he liked the sound of the words. He seemed to be having a very good time, and from the reactions of his students, small smiles and shakes of the head which they didn't try to hide from him, I figured that none of his sayings or his jokes or his general ebullience was new for today. This day, a day in mid-December 1999, had so far been quite ordinary, at least by Brigham standards. Farmer and his team had dealt with 6 cases, each something of a puzzle, except for the next to last case of the day, which seemed rather simple. The resident on the team, a young woman, presented the fact to Farmer, reading from her notes. A 35-year-old man, I'll call him Joe, HIV positive, smoked a pack of cigarettes a day, usually drank half a gallon of vodka, also used cocaine, both intravenously and by inhalation, recently overdosed on heroin, had a chronic cough which 5 days ago increased, became productive, yellow-green septum but no blood, and was accompanied by deep chest pain. He had lost 26 pounds over the last several months. The radiologist reported a possible right lower lobe infiltrate on his chest x-ray. Possible tuberculosis, they thought. The tools for uncovering tuberculosis belong to an older era in medicine, and the diagnosis can be tricky, especially with someone with HIV. Certainly, Joe was a likely target for tuberculosis. Of all the infections that can come crowding into a person with HIV disease, TB was the most common worldwide. The disease was rare in Boston, indeed, throughout the United States, except in the kinds of places where Joe lived, in homeless shelters and jails and on the streets and under bridges. But in spite of his HIV infection, Joe's immune system was still mostly intact, and he didn't have the classic symptoms of TB, which are fever, chills, and night sweats. He has terrible teeth, said the resident. She added, he's a nice guy. Farmer said, let's go see the x-ray, shall we? They went to another room and put Joe's chest x-ray up on the lighted viewing screen, and Farmer started, for less than a minute, at the spot where the radiologist thought they saw an infiltrate. Then he said, that's it? It's rather underwhelming. They headed upstairs to visit Joe. Farmer moved through the Brigham in a long-legged stride, making intermittent headways. He'd pause to receive a hug from a nurse's aide, then to exchange quips in Haitian Creole with a janitor. Then his beeper would go off. Answering the page, he'd greet the hospital operator, whichever of the dozen or so came online, and quickly ask about her blood pressure or her husband's heart condition or her mother's diabetes. Then he had to stop at the nurse's station to answer an email about a patient, then to answer a question from a cardiologist. Finally, stethoscope around his neck and singing in creative German, we are the world, we are the world. Farmer led the infectious disease team to the patient's door. Then everything slowed down. Wow, this part really showed how popular Dr. Farmer is in the hospital. Like, everyone loves him, and he is so knowledgeable. He can remember all of his patients and their families, and he cares about everyone so much. I really hope that I can meet this guy. Joe lay on his covers, dressed in blue jeans and a t-shirt. A small man with scarred and wiry arms and prominent collarbones. He had an unkempt beard and unruly hair, and when he smiled nervously at the doctors trooping in, I saw he still had most of his teeth, but probably won't for long. Farmer introduced himself and the members of his team. Then he sat down at the head of Joe's bed, on a corner of the mattress, folding himself half around Joe in an agile way that made me think of a grasshopper. He leaned over Joe, gazed down at him, pale blue eyes behind those little round lenses. For a moment, I thought Farmer might climb into bed with him. He placed a hand on Joe's shoulder instead and stroked it. Your x-ray looks good. I think it's probably pneumonia. A little bit of pneumonia. Let me ask you, how's your stomach? Do you have any gastritis these days? I'm eating everything inside of me. Everything in front of me I eat. Farmer smiled. You need to gain some weight, my friend. You've lost some weight. I didn't eat much when I was outside. I didn't eat much at all, messing around, doing this, doing that. Talk to us a little bit. We're in infectious disease, and we don't think it's tuberculosis. Before I say that, though, any exposure to anybody with TB? Joe didn't think so, and Farmer said, I think we should go ahead and make a recommendation that you not be isolated. We are ID, right? ID says hi. I think you don't need to have a negative airflow room and all that. Nah, a fella's in a boat by himself, you know. People come in with masks on their heads and wash their hands all the time. Yeah, said Farmer, adding, but washing the hands are good, though. This day was the first on which I'd seen him at work, and it seemed to me just then that his part in the case was closed. Fancy specialist is called in to answer a question. For once, it is vanishingly simple, at least for the specialist. He answers it, makes some small talk with the patient, then departs. But Farmer was still sitting on Joe's bed, and he seemed to like it here. They talked on and on. Judging from the resident's earlier report, she had asked many of the same questions as Farmer, but Joe was responding with greater candor now. He and Farmer talked about Joe's regular doctor, whom Joe liked, and the fact that Joe had taken antiretroviral medicine for his HIV, but only erratically. Joe confessed, and Farmer explained that he might well have acquired resistance to some of those drugs and probably shouldn't risk taking others until he find himself in a position to take them faithfully. They talked about drugs and alcohol, Farmer warning him against heroin. But really, the worst ones are alcohol and cocaine. We were saying downstairs during rounds. We were kind of joking around, saying, well, we should tell him to smoke more marijuana because that doesn't hurt much. If I smoke marijuana, I will create an international incident. Not in the hospital, Joe. The two men laughed, looking at each other. They talked about his HIV. Your immune system's pretty good, working pretty well. That's why I'm a little worried that you're losing weight, because you're not losing weight on account of HIV. You're losing weight because you're not eating, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, says Farmer softly. The way he stared at Joe's face just then seemed both intent, as if there were no one else in the world, and also focused elsewhere. I thought in his mind he might be watching Joe from a high window, as Joe went about what were known in social work as the activities of daily living, which in his case would mean scoring some narcotics on a corner and then heading off to his favorite bridge or underpass for camping. In the midst of all this, another person entered the room, a medical student whom Farmer had invited to join him on rounds. Farmer introduced her. Joe had asked all the doctors where they had gone to school. Now he asked the newcomer in his Boston accent, Are you a Harvard graduate too? Am I? She said. Yes. Wow, said Joe. He turned to Farmer. I got some people from high places looking at me, huh? She's a hot shot, Farmer said, and the conversation resumed. So tell us now, Joe, how can we help? Because we know how the system works here. You come in here, you like us, we like you, you're very nice to us, we're very nice to you, and I think you feel like people here treat you right at home. I feel kinda lonesome in this room, said Joe. That's true, and we're going to recommend that you get out of this, said Farmer. So here's my heavy question for you. Heavy, but good. What can you do for me? Yeah. You ain't gonna believe what I'm gonna say. You ain't ready for this, said Joe. I've heard it all, my friend. I'd like to have an HIV home where I could go to. Farmer was gazing down at him again. Yeah? Eat and sleep. Watch television. Watch games. I'd like somewhere where I can drink a six-pack. I understand. I'd like to go somewhere where I won't get into trouble. Maybe have a couple too many beers, as long as I'm doing what they tell me. And I'm home on time and I don't mess around, Sure. And I don't drive everyone crazy, running out the doors and everything, Somewhere I could maybe even have a bottle of wine for dinner or something. Yeah, said Farmer. I can see your point. He pursed his lips. So I'll tell you what. I'll look around, and you're going to be here probably a couple of days. And I don't think it's that crazy an idea at all, what you said. Is it better to be out on the street freezing to death, added Joe. Freezing to death, said Farmer. Or inside having a six-pack of beer or some wine with dinner. I know what I would want. The other thing is, if you have a place to stay, you could take medicine, if you want to take medicine. Yeah, said Joe, dubiously. Wow, I'm very surprised at the conversation between the patient and the doctor. The doctor is so laid back, he's so relaxed, he's talking as if this is like a close friend of him, not a patient who has serious illnesses and someone who has drug addiction problems and that. Because in life, people tend to hold negative prejudices against those people, but this doctor seemed to care him just the same way as everyone else, and I think this is a really great thing that he's doing. A few days later, on the message board outside the door of the Bringham's social work department, a cryptic handwritten message appeared. It looked like this: Joe, out. Cold, their drugs, 1/2 a gallon of vodka. In, warmth, our drugs, 6-pack bud. Beneath, someone had scrawled, "Why do I know Paul Farmer wrote this?" Friends of farmers have found a homeless shelter for Joe, but of course, the social workers had reminded Farmer that shelters forbade drinking, and for good reasons too. He was still pleading Joe's case, just to keep his promise, I supposed, not expecting to win the argument. Farmer was on service at the Brigham on Christmas. He spent part of the day visiting patients outside the hospital. He brought them all presents, including Joe, who got a 6-pack of beer, disguised in wrapping paper. Well, we don't really expect doctors to give their patients beer, but this is an interesting doctor who would do that. Joe seemed glad to see him, as well as the present. As Farmer was leaving the shelter, you hear Joe say to another resident, just loudly enough to make Farmer wonder if Joe meant for him to overhear, "That guy is a freaking saint." It wasn't the first time Farmer had heard himself called that. When I asked him his reaction, he said that he felt like the thief in Hawthorne's novel The Marble Faun, who steals something from a Catholic church and, before making his escape, dips his hand in holy water. I don't care how often people say you're a saint. It's not that I minded, it's that it's inaccurate. It was seemingly, I thought, resisting beautification. But he told me people call me a saint, and I said I have to work harder, because a saint would be a great thing to be. I felt a small inner disturbance. It wasn't that the words seemed immodest. I felt I was in the presence of a different person from the one I'd been chatting with a moment ago, someone whose ambitions I hadn't yet to fathom. So this doctor is so amazing and so kind to everyone, but when people compliment him, he said, "Well, that's not accurate. I'm not really that good." He seems like he's very modest, and despite all the good he has been doing, he still doesn't think he's doing enough. Farmer finished up his service at the Brigham and went to Haiti on New Year's Day 2020. 2000, not 2020. We had an exchange of emails. He had sent me a copy of his latest book, Infectious and Inequalities, a prodigiously footnoted discourse with case studies of individual patients to illustrate its main theme, the connection between poverty and disease, the maldistribution of medical technologies in the world, and the immodest claim of causality that scholars and health bureaucrats have offered for those phenomena. At times, it seemed that the author could hardly contain his anger. He described giving antibiotics to an impoverished TB patient, then wrote, "When she received them, she soon began to respond, almost as if she had a treatable infectious disease." The Paul Farmer who had written the book didn't seem much like the Paul Farmer who worked at the Brigham. This one was shouting on every page. I wrote to thank him for the book, and added that I planned to read his previous two. By email, he replied, "That's not my au revoir. To see my au revoir, you have to come to Haiti. That's the end of chapter 2. So far, I hope that you enjoyed this doctor's personality. And next time we'll see if the author goes to Haiti with him and witness his real work. Thanks for being with me today.